Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Atomic Podcast. As you all may know, or for those people new to the podcast, we're here to really talk across different technologies and approaches, both to AI, general AI, but also new technologies in biotech, quantum, as they touch our lives, as they touch our bodies, our healthcare, areas of consciousness. And so this is not about technologies. We're not going to just beat you over the head with technologies, but we really want to open up to both a expert and non-expert audience to really talk about how the world is changing right before us. And so I tend to bring speakers in, and I'm really excited to have a really wonderful guest today who are really at the threshold of some of these changes, and they are figuring them out themselves, as scientists, as lay people, as people in the community, as parents and so forth. We're all in this together, and I really appreciate that you all are going to be viewing this. So I'm today super excited to be introducing Mana Sobhani, and she's actually someone who you either haven't heard about yet, but you will. And she's a neuroscientist, a cognitive neuroscientist. And she's done some things with her research and also her approach to consciousness that I really want you to hear about, because it's quite a big transition. I'm not going to do a spoiler on this one. I'm going to let her speak on her background and her approach to cognitive neuroscience. Thank you, Mona.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's very exciting. Yes, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, traditionally trained. My dissertation research was on psychopathic traits. I did neuroimaging work, and I did a postdoc on law and neuroscience. So the application of how are we using neuroscience findings in the legal system? And then I moved into learning about venture capital and startups at UCLA. And then I went back to research in digital health. So using wearables and apps to measure physiology and behavior and try to predict health and outcomes. And then while I was doing that, I had an existential crisis and kind of a crisis of meaning and life. Had a series of, I guess, unusual events happen to me through my family, and we can get into that. And suddenly I went from being a very skeptical neuroscientist, very scientific materialist, to being an open-minded spiritual seeker, which was kind of a long journey and difficult, but the experiences that I had changed everything that I thought I knew about neuroscience, the brain, the mind, and consciousness. So that's where I am now. I wrote a book about all of my experiences, and I write a newsletter now, and I explore these topics in a lot of different ways.
Fantastic. And as a scientist, and we can redefine what you're doing. You're redefining what a scientist does and the meaning that they bring to neuroscience. So I think this is exciting. But maybe give the audience a little bit more detail on sort of what the day-to-day of a cognitive neuroscientist is, and then maybe transition to kind of what the day-to-day is now.
Okay. Yeah. As a cognitive neuroscientist, we do a lot of reading and thinking and planning for experiments. And then we do experiments. And a lot of it is, it just depends if you're more theoretical or you work with actual participants who come in for imaging. But really a lot of your time is spent, getting deep into a subject. So knowing the entire literature, going to conferences, making a research program, and then executing those experiments, analyzing data, writing papers, and then also writing grants. And then, conversing with other scientists, sharing ideas, sharing experiments. But your day-to-day is a lot of, just like anyone else, I think, meetings, reading, writing, anyone in academia. It's, pretty normal. And then my day-to-day now is very different. So, I work for myself. I have a consulting company where I do, more traditional neuroscience consulting for companies. But I do a lot of interviews for my book, and I do some blog writing and scientific writing for the Institute for Noetic Sciences, which is an institute that explores kind of exceptional human abilities, or the aspects of the universe that are more noetic. So I do some writing for them, and then I write my newsletter. So it's sort of similar. I mean, I don't work with human subjects anymore, so that part of it's gone, but I do spend a lot of time reading, writing, thinking, and meeting with people. So in that way, it's pretty similar.
Yeah, because the way you were painting the neuroscience researcher, and it was really clearly about planning, experimenting, getting outputs from that experiment, or of course getting funding, and then moving on to the next experiment, which is not too dissimilar to other sciences. And yet, in the cognitive neuroscience, you were after certain outcomes, and maybe you can touch about some of those outcomes using, functional MRI and some things, and then how those getting after those outcomes are so different, and your approach to achieving outcomes and the idea of evidence might be different.
Yes. So let me think of how to answer that. It's a very interesting question, very different from what I usually get. uh, so I think, yeah, actually, I started talking about this because I sort of realized it when I was still doing experimental science in graduate school, or still doing neuroimaging work. But I really realized it after this transformation that I had looking back on science. But scientists are also storytellers, right? we're when we're analyzing our data, first we have a hypothesis, we pre-plan the analyses that we're going to do, and then we analyze the data. And many times you are surprised because you don't get what you were expecting, which is what kind of makes science fun. Although while you're doing it, it can be quite frustrating. And that that aspect of we didn't quite get what we wanted involves storytelling. And I remember in lab meetings, we would discuss the findings together to find the story there. Like, how are we going to explain this? How are we going to, like the theory that we had, it doesn't quite cover this. So how do we, how do we explain it? And that's usually what the discussion section of the scientific paper does, is explain what you got right and be like, yeah, we were right. This was the theory. We thought this were fine. And then you get to the section where things didn't go right. And then you have to tell your story. And so I think that I was always aware of that, but I think actually through, this is kind of funny, but through a psychedelic retreat that I did, they had us do this exercise where you had to like write the biography of your life, and then you had to do it a few different times from different angles. And you suddenly, through that exercise, realize like before you do it, you think you have one story of your life. And then after you do it, you're like, whoa, there's a million different threads and stories in my life. There's so many different angles. And then I had the epiphany that that's what we do in science too, is that there's all these different angles and threads of stories, and you kind of just pick one that fits. And that was also my part of my wake up call, just in science, thinking this is not really as objective as we would like to believe that it is.
So the idea of evidence here is something that you're saying is quite fluid.
Mm-hmm.
We build stories to maybe not just appease funders or the scientific community, but sometimes to appease ourselves and our own status as a scientist, right?
Oh, definitely, definitely for yourself. Yes. Because
Yeah.
sometimes it's very confronting when you're looking at those findings to have something that's an outlier or just not what you expect. It can shake it can throw you off course. It can kind of shake your confidence. And yeah.
And so kind of the question is that you said you had, there's certain kind of stories or approaches to narrative of explaining scientific evidence in cognitive neuroscience that you would pick from. But it sounds to me that you would invent as well. So the idea of presenting science, one that's accessible even to peer review boards, is cogent, but also is something that really makes sense, even when all the evidence or part of the evidence is coming back negative. And so is part of being a scientist in the cognitive neuroscience field, and I think it's mostly part of being more broadly, is the ability to be a good writer, a good evidence writer. I'm inventing things,
Yo,
or
yeah.
is it okay?
Oh, I mean, I do remember this early on in graduate school. I noticed that the best scientists were the best storytellers, the best presenters. I mean, not the best presenters were not always the best scientists, but I realized very quickly. I hope all the scientists don't get angry at me, but I'm sure a lot of them, if they're honest with themselves, they'll realize it's true. But it really is the people who do well in academia, they just learn the game really well. And a lot of the game is storytelling and is telling a good story and getting evidence for it. And then if, making it fit however you can. But a lot of it is that, and they build on it right over the years. And then they just continue building findings on their theory, and it turns into a really nice story. And there are ways that you can do that. It becomes evident to you when you're working in the field how you can do that. And I remember thinking, I don't want to play a game like this. Like, I don't want to do this. Like, it doesn't seem, it's not what I came into science for.
Yeah, and yet the idea of, because storytelling is civilizational. It's a very human quality. It drives our lives if you really want to
Mm-hmm.
look at it. So it's a great thing to have. Really, what I'm hearing you say though is that sometimes storytelling is trying to fit the evidence to the story or the story to the evidence when
Yeah.
that fit is really not aligned, correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you would see people choose research agendas too, based on that's what I think people don't understand in science. Everything's driven by funding, so it's not like the startup world where you can have a wild idea and pitch it, and someone might fund it. Like in science, that rarely ever happens. Like you have to pitch ideas in projects that have some sort of evidence already, or someone studied it, that there's funding for, and and then you have to craft your theories to what's available. And so yeah, it's kind of it's important. It's an important skill, like you said. And I'm not saying it's disingenuous. I'm just saying, I mean, I didn't want to do that because I just felt it was a little bit, I mean, it's just, again, not why I went into science. Like I didn't want to shape things in that way.
So could we talk a little bit about, I think, some areas that you might be shaping, or at least I'll say channeling or taking on or experiencing, which is you mentioned this really interesting word. You said that you're part of a group of scientists that flipped. Um, so I kind of want to understand, and for the audience to understand what flip means, and kind of your journey into a whole new kind of, I guess, level of understanding of consciousness from your background, but going forward. So what does flip mean? And what are you
Yeah.
flipping? What are you flipping to?
So it's not my word. It's from Jeff Kripal, who is he's the chair of wait, let me get it right. The chair of philosophy and religious thought at Rice University. And he's a professor of comparative religion. So he's amazing. He wrote a book called The Flip, and it's about scientists who have quote unquote flipped from being scientific materialists, which is the philosophy that reality is composed of physical matter, and that's all there is to it. There's nothing else. And so that is the philosophy that mainstream science today in the Western world operates under, is that assumption. And he writes about in the book that works very well for scientists like me before the flip, until they have a experience. Usually it's a personal experience of something that happens to them that is so powerful and emotional that they can't deny it, and it shakes their worldview, shakes their scientific materialism, and causes confusion and misunderstanding. And then usually, or sometimes, I mean, it depends on the experience, it can be powerful enough that their worldview flips. So he talks about once their worldview has flipped, um, then they can't go back usually. But he talks about which is true, you do end up living almost in two different realities which I think is also mirrored in our country with the political parties. But you really do end up living in two different realities, because the people who haven't experienced it really cannot imagine what is happening, right? They're still in the scientific materialist paradigm. They haven't experienced something worldview flipping, so they're not flipped and they don't understand it. And in the West, you only have two options. Those people who believe in that are like stupid, or they're delusional and crazy and hallucinating. Those are the two options. So, but that I got that idea from Jeff Kripal because I read that book, and I think it just resonated so much. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm so glad somebody wrote this book and gave all these beautiful examples. He had stories of a few different scientists, and a really interesting story with Mark Twain. But he had all these really cool stories of people who had these experiences that were worldview flipping. And then he talks about, it seems difficult to comprehend from the Western scientific materialist worldview because it's a box, right? It's like your perception's in a box. It's a certain way of thinking. You can't get out of it. But once that's been flipped open, suddenly it's not a big deal, and you understand there are other philosophies of reality that include those experiences that really a majority of humanity has had. And he writes beautifully about when that happens, suddenly the scientists can see, oh, I had to ignore so much human experience to make this philosophy fit. And now I don't have to do that anymore. And so he writes really beautifully. I love it. So that's where I got the idea. And I thought it was, and it really feels like a flip. Like it's like your whole world is turned upside down and you don't have foundation anymore. You don't know who you are. You don't know what the world is anymore. I mean, so it really is, it feels like a flip.
Yeah, could you maybe talk a little bit about so we're on this other side of the so-called flip, okay? That idea of that now it's possible to account not only for some kind of experience that's human experience, but actually experience that it becomes now a whole new domain of your life, but also as a scientist of exploration.
Mm-hmm.
So could you talk about your, how you've come to consciousness or an understanding of consciousness differently? And
Oh,
what's that look like today? Because there's different models of consciousness.
yes. It's such a well, I don't like to get into the intellectual debates about it anymore because they're so messy. But
Mhm.
when I started getting into this, I remember I was reading a lot because that's what I knew what to do. That's what I did as a scientist, was read and research and memorize and build models in my head. So that's what I did. And I remember though, as I was meeting with people, I was interviewing flip scientists and spiritual people. A lot of them said to me, and I wasn't ready for it at the time, but a lot of them said to me, they said, I know you're reading a lot, but at some point you should really experience these things. And they kept saying it to me. And I'm like, I hear you. I do. I'm not ready. Like, I get it. And it's funny, at first didn't even understand what they meant, but then slowly I started to understand. I was like, yeah, they're right. I mean, and I had been meditating for years, but I had never had any profound experience in meditation really. But I started actively doing all other altered states of consciousness like psychedelics and breath work, past life regression. I mean, you name it, I tried everything. And then I started to see what they meant, because it really is like Jeff Kripal also talks about in his book, like people, if you don't have the experience, you can't imagine the experience. It's something you have to feel and see for yourself. And once I did that, then I understood what they meant by exploring consciousness. Like they also kept saying that to me. And I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever. But then I understood, because it's like a whole new world opens up to you. And I explain it like this. Sometimes it's like stepping from 2D into 3D and realizing, oh, I'm not a flat square on a page, like I'm a cube. And it's so hard to put into words, but it's like all this space opens up in your being and your experience. And it's like everything is so much more alive, which if you haven't experienced it, sounds ridiculous. But if you have, you know what I mean. So yeah, it completely I mean, I never even thought about consciousness when I was in neuroscience because it's a complicated field in neuroscience. It's kind of like a weird thing to study. So I didn't like those philosophical debates. I never thought about it. But after all of this, I thought, oh, now consciousness is interesting to me. Now I get it.
And because, you know, there, I don't want to bring up the debates, but I'll just bring up one since there's been so much discussion in AI for years, and also brain function and the writings of Daniel Dennett and so many others. Is that there's the understanding that we can build AI that has very similar aspects to the brain function. The function of models, you know, map to the function of the brain neurally. And that if we do that well enough, then there's an emergent property called consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, machines can have consciousness as we develop them in more sophisticated forms, and that's very present today. By the way, I mean I'm sure you're aware of that. You know,
Mm-hmm.
in these kinds of AGI discussions.
Yes.
I think that's very, very off base, but it is very, very deeply embedded in the debate. Um, and it's not about my opinion about this. But what's really interesting to me is how we actually build ourselves better, not how we build machines better. How do we
Mm-hmm.
actually enhance ourselves to a place in which we are the 3D, we are that dimensional self?
Mm-hmm.
And I think by forgetting that and shooting in another direction towards machines and giving them that, I find such a misalignment there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how you see that.
Oh, yes. That's so beautiful that you brought that up because I feel the same way. Like I used to be really interested in AI also, and I'm still interested in it. You know, I'm interested in all these developments and stuff. But now that I've stepped, as I said, from 2D into 3D, and then I think about AI, there's such a huge disconnect there of I, like they're so focused around you know, because you know what AI, I mean, when you think about the brain, we have left hemisphere, right hemisphere, right? There's actually really well documented differences between the hemispheres, where in the left brain is much more um, linear, um, rational, analytic, small view, right? Like no changes. This is what I believe. Like the right brain is much more like holistic and contextual and open minded. And I feel actually like this through this whole experience, like after graduate school, I was in my left brain. And then through like all these experiences, my thinking suddenly broadened and widened. And I threw out the reductionist filter and I could suddenly see things, you know, in better context and wider. And sometimes I think of that. I think of like AI as just like left brain because which is kind of funny because it is language models right now and languages in the left hemisphere, but it's very like left brain and based on the past and it's like missing that right brain creativity. And sometimes you know, and I just wonder, I'm like, it's interesting that people say these things about AI because like the definition of creativity is like something like brand new and it's like all these models are based on the past and I don't understand them that well but apparently even people who work with it don't either but how much creativity is in there and I don't so I mean I definitely after this experience think of it very differently and like to me there's an even bigger disconnect between machines and humans like I feel like but I can understand why people don't see that because I feel like we've moved so left brain. Ian McGilchrist is a neuroscientist who writes and talks about this a lot. And he talks about like our whole society is very left brain and it's a problem like because of this. A lot of the problems we see, he argues, is because of that. But I do see that in this AI thing of like the reason we can't see the limitations of it is because we're in that box, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I'm just wondering if, in breaking out of that box, breaking out of that analytical left brain way of thinking, what you talk about 2D into 3D in terms of your experience and your approaches to, I'm assuming, research, writing another book or books, and relationships. Like how is writing in your own research and relationships now that you're in the dimensional world as opposed to the flat world?
Yeah.
I'm using your terms, but
Yes.
I understand. I completely understand.
Um,
I know it's a
yeah.
big, I'm asking a big question.
No, actually, I'm going to answer that. I think I'm going to tie it back to the last one too, because there's something I forgot to mention there also. So in this journey that I've been going through what everyone seems to be calling a healing journey, which I don't love the term. I don't love that phrase, but it's true. You are healing. It's like it's a lot of emotional release and to use popular terminology, rewiring your nervous system, to, undo a lot of the conditioning you've picked up and all of that. And again, that's what I think it's interesting, all this focus on AI, when it's like, we don't need more AI. We need the people making the AI to go on these healing journeys. Is what we need. We need them to step out of 2D and go into 3D and then come back and look at their computers, because then, they'll see the huge disconnect. And all of this comes through in everything you do, right? All my relationships, all my writing, to come back to what you asked, because I've changed so drastically through this. Like there was like this persistent background anxiety and noise. And that's why I had an existential crisis, right? It's like persistent background, like fear and anxiety. And why are we here? And what is the point of this? And I have to prove myself and I have to accomplish and I have to earn, and all of this like noise. And then when I had these, I broke open to spirituality and had some experiences, and then started just opening, because I was so tired. I think I was just so freaking tired of all of the noise, and my nervous system was like burnt out. And then you go through these practices that start to like release a lot of, honestly, energy, like, you know, um, anxiety, all this stuff just starts to release, and you start to feel relief, and all of that it changes the who you are and the way you behave, so it changes how you can relate to other people. Like I felt like, I feel now I can connect to people a lot more deeply, because before I felt like all that noise was between us, like white noise, and the space between us, I could never hear anyone because I could never get past my own noise in my head. And it's the same with the writing, like I think I used to write what I thought people wanted to read, or I tried to be as smart as possible. Like the most important thing to me was being viewed as smart. Like everyone had to know I was smart and I had to achieve. And now I just don't care about that really, at all. And so I think my writing can be more honest, right? It comes from, again, like I think when I talk to people, I can tell that what they appreciate is me being vulnerable with them. And so I can bring that to the writing because I've healed. It's hard to be vulnerable when you're not healed, right? It hurts too much. So I think it's changed everything for me. I don't think I'm done. I don't think I'm perfect, but I think it's significantly reduced the noise and changed a lot of things, for the better.
And so when you're thinking about your spiritual journey here, and writing about that spiritual journey, do you have any thoughts of kind of directions? Not so much what the book will be or articles, but what you're exploring in your writing. Is it a chronicle of your own experiences, or are you experiencing because you're writing, or some combination thereof? Because writing is
Hmm.
experiential, is a discovery. I write
Yeah.
about things I don't know about
Yeah.
in order to
Yes.
know something,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
definitely.
not solely, but my most interesting work is I don't know where to go from here. That kind
Hmm.
of work.
Oh, that's good to hear, because that's where I am right now.
No, that's
um, yeah, the book I wrote, the first one I wrote was very cathartic. It was helped me pull everything together in my mind, in my experience, right? Because I think when you're going through the flip, all that noise I was talking about, it just really comes up and everything becomes very confusing. So it's like you don't know what is going on. And I remember when I wrote the book, oh, I was so grateful that it started to clear. Like I started to understand, I started to pull it together and understand it. And in the book, I tried to like first it was about evidence. Like I went looking for evidence for spiritual reality because I couldn't just believe. I was really jealous of people who could just believe. I was like, God, how do they do it? Like they just trust. They just have faith. They just believe. Like I didn't understand because I just couldn't do that. I was like, I need something. Like even if it's not very good evidence, like I needed to know there was something. So I went looking for that, and then the idea behind the book was to publish some of what I found that convinced me that at least there's a possibility. There is. It's not a definite no. um, but then when I had actually went in the book, you can see me go between back and forth between like left brain, right brain, or between creative and between scientific writing. And the first draft, I had my friends read it and they were like, where are you in this book? Like, and some of them had faith. So they were like, I can take or leave the science. I want to hear how you flipped or like what it was like for you. And so I started to put more of that in the book. And I think also when I started to edit it with the and I had done more things, so I started to put those in, and so I wanted it to be. Plus, I had read a lot of books of like evidence. There's no lack of those, but what I didn't find a lot of, which is why I had to go interview people to get it, was um, this is hard. Was it hard for you? How did you get through it? How come no one's talking about it? Like, what do I do? And so I started to put some of that, I just started to put some of that in the book of the difficulty. It was also, and it was really, really challenging, we call it the dark night of the soul. It was a really challenging time for me. So I, uh, it was kind of good to just get it out there and let people know that it was hard for me instead of just writing a book and saying, hey, I found evidence and here's this nice book. I thought I should be honest about. Um, I woke up every morning doubting it. I changed my mind daily. My brain wouldn't stop thinking. I was like in mental anguish. My nervous system was on fire. My identity was there was no identity anymore. Like there was a lot going on, and none of it was easy or pleasant. And I didn't want it. I didn't ask for it. It just happened, and I couldn't stop it. Um, and so I just wanted to be honest about that because I felt like I wasn't getting a lot of that from other people, or I hadn't found a lot of books like that. And I get why, because it's hard to tell that story because it's not a very nice story, right? It's difficult. So, and I think it is hard to be vulnerable about it. And I don't think a lot of people want to put themselves out there like that. So I thought I would do it.
Yeah, I think that there's, if I think about stories like the larger stories, like the hero story, adventure stories, uh, even romantic stories, they're epic stories. Some of them, Shakespeare proved it. Um, and the idea, though, that we need to be a finished product at every state of our lives is really very damaging.
Mm-hmm.
As a scholar, as a business person, just personally, is it sounds to me that your journey is the journey that you're on right now, that you left in terms of using this word again, flip, going to this side and feeling a sense of wholeness or more wholeness,
Mm-hmm.
is there's no quite destination, um, but there is a deeper sense of gratitude and feeling and a deeper sense of really what's possible, really to write about to include in science, to make really, vibrant in our lives, but also in our sciences, right?
Oh my
Um,
gosh, yes.
I mean, it's like, oh my, yeah. I mean, I come to you because of Jonas Kaplan, who talked about empathy in relationship to AI. It's like, wait, I got to talk to someone like that. Now he has his own take.
Jonas.
He's I don't know which side he's on, but he's probably more on the left. He hasn't flipped yet. But yeah, but the point is that seeing this melding of the arts and sciences, seeing this melding of left and right hemisphere, seeing this idea of opening experience that has much more, dimensionality is super important, and it seems like it's getting more siloed. you know,
Yes, yes,
I don't
yes.
know. I'm just telling you kind of a sense I have.
Yeah. No, I agree. Once I started to, um, I mean, I talk about it like this old me, and I always say like old me and new me. Old me would have hated this language. She would hate that I'm saying this, but my heart was really, really closed. I mean, it's true. Like I had closed myself off from feeling a lot of things, because I thought I had to be serious and unemotional. Part of that came from science, but part of it, I'm sure, just came from culture. But in any case, I was. And then once I started to open it through these spiritual practices and all of this healing work, I started to see our society very differently. And I started noticing, for sure science, but I noticed it in business first. I was like, it's so crazy how like our whole system is inhumane. No one talks about it. It's like everything is about profits, which is why everything is inhumane. But no one uses that language, and they should. It is actually inhumane to put profits above humans, to put, like to make people work and only give them 2 weeks off a year because of your quarterly profits. So I saw it in business first, and then I saw it in science. And then I was like, wow, science is also lacking so much heart and feeling. And I mean, one of the core things of science is inner subjective experience doesn't matter. Like, hello, what? That's the only thing we have. That's all we have is interacting with each other. But that's kind of a basic thing in neuroscience. And you start to really see, um, what's your inner subjective experience. I mean, part of that is your heart and like the way you relate with people, and none of that is like allowed in science. We'll try to measure it with surveys or whatever, but it's not important. Like the emphasis in my neuroscience education was sensory motor, like that kind of stuff. And so it starts to, I think, once you start to change, your perception starts to change, of course. But yeah, I started seeing that in our whole society. There's and I talk about in the book about that because I started realizing one of the reasons is that we are so siloed, and we're so like neuroscience is siloed. We don't even learn about psychology, which you think that we would. Like you think like at least we would learn about that, but we don't. We don't learn about the mind, clinical psychiatry, psychology, nothing, much less philosophy. No, you don't even know that you're working under scientific materialism. I didn't even know what that word meant. Um, so when you didn't know there's a possibility for other philosophies, you don't know about psychedelics, ethnobotany, about anthropology, about all these other cultures that have, incorporated spirituality like as a part of their basic living, and they've survived and managed for thousands of years. P.S. much happier than we are here in the West. So I started to realize that too, and I was like, man, we really need the humanities like way more. Like people need to, and I feel like there's such a push for science and technology still, which is of course important because it's gotten us very far. But I think if you lose the humanities, I mean, again, you lose that aspect of like literally humanity, like the things that make us human. Like what are the art, dance, music, like those things that we can't measure that well with science. Like those things are what make us human, happy, and interesting. And we just seem to like not care that much or just keep emphasizing science and technology. So, I mean, I worry about that. Yeah. And I don't have a solution for it. But when I talk about that. that when I talk to scientists, I tell them, please, for the love of God, pick up a philosophy book or a psychiatry book or anything other than your field, whatever you study. Like, really need to broaden your horizons.
I could not share your thoughts and sentiment more. I this morning I was literally turning red. I read just a piece on Twitter. It was an engineer of some kind who said it'll be great when the humanities, philosophy, history are the way I'm just paraphrasing are they're put out of work basically
Oh,
because now they can be put to more productive roles
oh.
in engineering. And it was so naked, you know what I mean? It's so crude and
Mm-hmm.
naked.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a generation or generations that have come up that haven't had this experience that you're sharing with us, that don't even know to have that experience. That's the scary thing. They don't even know that there is this dimensionality to human experience. That they don't even know. Just use anthropology, and they scream, running up.
It's true.
Yeah. So the idea is all of that is weaker. It's not the strong sciences. It's not relevant sciences. It's not relevant
Mm-hmm.
experience. But the point I'm just trying to make is that that idea of our humanity in humanities, and that we need to think about that and double down on that more now than ever. Uh, in this age of AGI, in this age of generative AI, is to me super important that we make that
Yeah.
argument. I'm writing about it, so I'm going to try to make at least
Oh,
one
good.
little contribution. But the point is that it's not that we need the humanities less. We actually need them much more than we ever have needed them,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that is just I don't know. Anyway, I don't
Yeah.
want to I don't want to get going.
No, I was going to say that was one of the things that I had conditioned into me that I had to uncondition was this idea that I should always be doing something productive. And I mean, that was as you know, it's a really hard one to undo because of our phones and like we're conditioned to, oh, I have 10 minutes. Let me respond to this email or whatever. Like, let me do a task so I'm productive. It's so deeply ingrained. You really can't see it. A lot of people can't see it. But, and I don't remember, maybe it was I don't remember how I came to the insight, but I suddenly realized I didn't have to do that. And that a lot of, oh, like this is one. I used to love reading fiction. But by the time I finished grad school, I completely stopped reading fiction, and I was like, I should read something, like a science book. Like I should be productive. Um, and then I used to paint, um, and not like creative expression. Like I would just copy something, sketch it on with my ruler or whatever, and paint it in. And then honestly, after I did psychedelics, I was like, I actually brought the paint out for a psychedelic trip just so I would have something to do. And then I loved it so much that I was like, oh my God, I forgot how much I love doing this. And then I started using it for creative expression, which, old me would have been like, this is such a waste of time. You're not going to sell it. What are you going to do with that, with this painting? Um, but it made me so happy, like in a way that I hadn't been in years, that it almost like woke me up like, oh, wow, I forgot this emotion of happiness, of like contentness, of um, expression for the sake of expression. And that was one of those things that I had to be like, this is not a waste of time. And then I had to start just questioning every thought I had. That's what started happening, which was also tiring. But I'm like, what's a waste of time? What should I be doing with my time? Why do I have to do something productive? Who says? And I just started questioning every thought that came in like that until I realized, yeah, a lot of it was just nonsense.
In the psychedelic journey that has been, it sounds like a pretty big part of your journey. It
Mm-hmm.
certainly has facilitated your journey. Is tell us a little bit more about that and how you've used psychedelics and how you maybe even plan to use them.
Yes. So I was never interested in psychedelics. I didn't know anything about them like most people. Well, I guess people know about them now, but I didn't know. I just thought they were hallucinogens, and I thought people take them for a good time. But when I was doing research for the book and speaking to researchers about exceptional human experiences, one of them mentioned to me, he's like, "Oh, have you looked into psychedelics? Like some really weird stuff happens on psychedelics." So I went to read about it, and he was right. There's this long documented history of psychedelics being, I mean, indigenous traditions have always used them for spiritual purposes. In addition to like drumming or chanting or putting themselves in altered states, like sometimes they would just take a psychedelic substance, a plant medicine, and they would use it for divination purposes. They would use it for communicating with spirits, a lot of things that we roll our eyes at in the West, but whatever, they used it. It worked for them. Um, and then, but also in the 50s and 70s and 50s, 60s and 70s, when psychedelics came to America, Aldous Huxley, all the people who, Gordon Wasson, all the people who brought the Westerners who brought psychedelics to the culture at the time also had those experiences, like experiences they couldn't explain with Western science, things, basically getting information from other places in time that they shouldn't be able to get, that then turns out to be true. And so then I was suddenly interested in psychedelics. And then I found out there was a renaissance going on. Modern day research was looking into it. And then just from a purely neuroscientific perspective, I was like, wow, these substances work better than a lot of our behavioral health therapies. The effectiveness in patients was high. So I got really interested in them. I read everything I could. I was just like, what are they doing? Because these, the chemicals were each different from each other molecularly, but they worked similarly in the people. So I was really fascinated, like, what is going on? And they were very healing. So I read this handbook from the 50s, I think, written by therapists for therapists working with LSD with their patients. And it was, honestly, I've read a lot, and it was the best thing I've read still to this day, because they talk about the trip like hour by hour, and they talk about how it heals the patients. And they're like, it gets their conscious ego defenses out of the way. And they can ask themselves questions, like they can write questions beforehand, and then they can ask themselves the questions. And under the influence of LSD, they literally just get the answers from their subconscious. And then when they come out of it, they have the answers. They have to integrate it into their behavior, but a lot of their personal problems would be like resolved. And so the therapist thought it was miraculous, like, and they were on their way to testing it with a lot of disorders before it was outlawed in the 70s by the government. So I took that handbook and got some LSD and had a friend babysit me. I had tried shrooms before, but it was very like low dose, just a good time. It was like a giggly good time. But the LSD trip was intense. That was when I felt like I stepped into 3D. It was like my whole being like expanded. I had energy like flooding my system. It felt like my nervous system was electric. My spine was like electric. I had energy shooting up and down, and my emotions, right? I felt emotions so deeply, like I was the emotion, and then they would change quickly. And I was like, that's what I mean by it's like 3D. And especially for someone who, like I said, my heart was kind of like closed, to step into that space, you're like, whoa, I am missing so much on a day-to-day basis of the human experience. Like, what is this? What have I been missing? And then I had written a question like, what's my biggest problem right now? And like 5 hours into the trip, I asked myself that. And I didn't think it was going to work. I thought this just sounds too good to be true. But it did. I got an answer from my mind that said, you forgot to be weird. And it said you like forgot to have fun, and you forgot that you don't have to be serious all the time, and that you project who you think you're supposed to be, you project who you think people want you to be. And then it kind of like gave me a montage of all these times in my life when I betrayed myself. And it was really emotional and transformative. and eye-opening. And like I had been in therapy and I had done breath work, and I was nowhere near coming to this very deep, obvious insight. So I was sold. I was like, what is this? I don't care what it is. This is amazing. Everyone should do this. But then, um, and I continued to use them, but not in a crazy way. Like I do really believe in integration. You have to integrate that experience. And even though you have the insight, it's not like your behavior changes all of a sudden. You're just aware, oh, I have this behavioral pattern that I do. And then the work begins of like, okay, so let me not project who I think I'm supposed to be. But then you have to notice when you're doing it. And then you have to learn a new way of being, right? You have to not do what you've been doing for years and years. So then the work begins. So I believe in taking it slow. And I did other sessions that were guided by other, facilitators. And those were interesting too. And it's really helpful to have somebody who knows what they're doing. You definitely have to feel safe, in a safe set and setting. And you're not even I'm not supposed to like, I don't recommend anyone does it. It's not legal in California yet. It's not legal in the entire US yet, only in certain places. But if it's a safe set and setting, or somewhere where it's legal, like it's pretty phenomenal. It cuts to, but it's not the only way. There's breath work also works just as well to any altered state that kind of makes you relaxed and relaxes your ego defense. You can get answers and you can start to heal, change, whatever you want to call it. So I also didn't have any of those paranormal experiences personally on psychedelics. I mean, only one thing. I had one where a friend and I were doing shrooms together, and we both quietly wrote down our intentions. We didn't tell each other what they were. He like put in his pocket, and I put in my purse or something. And then like 5 minutes later, I just said something to him like, oh, you know what I've been thinking about? And I don't remember what it was. And he was just staring at me wide eyed. And I was like, what's wrong? And then he went and got his intention and gave it to me. And it was like exactly what I just said. And so I was like, oh, that's funny. But, we also knew each other really well. So who knows? But yeah, they're really interesting substances. And I think I had one more. Can I discuss one more?
Sure. Yes,
Okay.
sure.
So yeah, the LSD one was great for like personal growth and insight. It was great for feeling the depth of emotion and feeling. Oh, I also had the like sense that we were inside of which is common on psychedelics, but like the sense that we're inside of like a movie or something. And I kept telling my friend, I was like, I think we're inside WandaVision, something like that. But I also did 5-methoxy DMT, which is a very strong, the strongest psychedelic. And I had complete ego dissolution, which means I didn't exist anymore. I dissolved and I became the entire universe, all of space and time, and had the sense that it never ends. Like I was every particle on the entire edge of the universe expanding, and all of it at once, but I wasn't like me anymore. I was just like awareness. And I think that was another one that blew my conception of space and time and beingness apart. Like I came back from that feeling like half of me was still flying out in the universe somewhere. And yeah, and it just changed the way that I finally understood. I also watched in that trip, I watched my awareness separate from my mind and look back on it, which they talk about in the spiritual traditions, that like there's an awareness that's the true you, and then there's your mind that's like the ego that's chattering. And my awareness like looked back on my mind and was like, oh, you're still talking. She was like, oh no, you can stop now, you can quiet down. But I had that sense of that happening, and then before I dissolved completely. So it's like it was kind of a fast track to experiencing those deeper spiritual levels that people talk about. Like I don't recommend it for everyone because like the 5-MeO was super, super intense. I've never recommended to anyone, but I mean, I'm grateful for my experience because it really expanded my understanding or the way I think about consciousness. I finally understood. I felt like I finally understood what consciousness was in that moment. Um, so I think that they're useful tools in that way. They've definitely blown things open for me.
Yeah, and I think that it's a wonderful way to put it. I know it sounds a little clunky, but tools is probably a great way to put it. And is that for some people, maybe it's a journey, for others, it's a tool, but I think they're both. Um, and I wanted to ask you because we talked a while back about kind of upcoming conference, and
Mhm.
you're holding a kind of your own I'll call it the powwow on that sort of interconnection between neuroscience and spirituality. It sounds like a really interesting panel. Could you speak to that so people know about it?
Yes. So last year, so we have a Society for Neuroscience annual conference. It's the largest, I think it's the largest science conference, like 30,000 scientists every year. And last year we did a neuroscience and spirituality social, and 50 scientists showed up, which is pretty exceptional. I mean, we had a tiny room. I thought no one would come, but they showed up and they were really excited to talk about all these topics. So we thought we would do it again this year, but this year we wanted to talk about we wanted to actually talk about some models, because last year was very unorganized. It was kind of a social, and this year we thought, oh, we should have some speakers come. So we put together, it's called Revolution in Neuroscience, alternative models of consciousness, because in recent years there have been alternative models, as I said, of consciousness published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. So the normal view, as you mentioned, is that the brain generates consciousness, that it somehow emerges from our neurons. We don't know how, but somehow. And then in more recent years, there have been some other theories proposed of like, well, maybe consciousness is part of an electromagnetic field. Maybe it's a fundamental energy or a fundamental aspect of the universe. Maybe when it interacts with our physical brains, we become aware. There's all these different theories published. So we got some of the interesting thinkers. It's Jonathan Schooler, Julia Mossbridge, Donald Hoffman, and Bernardo Kastrup, who's a computer scientist, actually. And then we have Christoph Koch. He's going to join the discussion. So those four, it's four, right, are going to present. And then my collaborator and I will present on why we're doing this. And then we'll have a huge discussion with everyone. So we're very excited because it applies to one of the questions that came up when we were talking about it was, if we don't know what consciousness is in humans, how will we know in AI? And there's also, in the news, lots of talk about UAPs. So there's a lot of people interested in non-human intelligence. If that's a thing, how will we measure consciousness in them? Or so these are questions that we've received, we've been, have been thrown around, and that scientists are actually really eager to talk about in an open space. So we thought no one was putting that space together, so we thought we'd do it.
Yeah, and one of the things that when you said that 50 scientists showed up to this last one, people don't realize what that actually means, because to have 50 scientists show up to explore a
Mm-hmm.
spiritual side or alternative models of consciousness is a huge step forward.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yes,
and this sounds like this will be even bigger.
we have the capacity to hold 600 people in the room because we knew it was going to be popular. And so it's in Washington, D.C. And you're right. So last time in the room, I thought no one was going to show up, and I thought they were going to ask really specific questions or dance around these topics. But immediately people were talking about, like, I read about this reincarnation research from the University of Virginia. Have you heard about that? Some other scientist was like, I have these dreams that come true months, like all the time, like months in advance. What are those called? We had physician who was a very experienced physician who was telling us all these crazy stories that he's had with his patients. And then we had somebody talk about, I mean, it was like insane. My collaborator and I were just standing there like, oh, wow. Like, I always say these are typical human experiences, but that event proved to me that they are. And like that Jeff Kripal says, like scientists are human too. So they are having these experiences too. They just have no one to talk about it with.
You know, Mona, I think one of the things that comes to mind here and is that science is about pushing frontiers, right?
Mm-hmm.
The certain levels of understanding to take us to another level of understanding. Um, overturning hypothesis, taking us places we haven't been, and you're taking us places that we actually maybe knew as a child,
Mm-hmm.
but we forgot. And you're also taking us to new places. So to me, this is the essence of good science, even though you're not the traditional scientist as you once were, and doesn't sound like how would you ever want to be. Uh,
No.
but this really is the essence of good science because you're discovering a whole kind of new realm of connections that are spiritual, for want of a better phrase, but certainly circle around consciousness and our
Mm-hmm.
use and understanding. And, I want to use the word leverage, but our understanding of what's inherent in ourselves that's so beautiful and filled with wonder. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but also, as you say, filled with ancient wisdom that we civilizations have survived incredibly well with this knowledge. We better get on it.
Yeah, they
But
survived for a long time without technology just fine.
yes, exactly, but we better get on this knowledge that you're presenting today because it might be important for our own survival.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I would just want to say well, thank you for saying that. And then
Yeah.
also that was something that I came up against in the very beginning of the journey was was this first was the uh, conditioned idea in my head that this stuff is stupid and delusional. But then as I kept reading and the evidence kept accumulating, I kept trying to be a scientist and be open-minded and follow the evidence. And I kept coming up against, right, this like paradigm that wouldn't allow. It was like follow the evidence, but then it was like, no, that's impossible. And it was that back and forth that was hard for me. And that's why I wanted to come out and be like, hey, you guys don't have to go through all the mental anguish I did, even though you probably will. But yeah, isn't science about curiosity and open-mindedness and not just throwing stigma on stuff because you don't want to believe it. So I hope we can change that because it matters for people. And that's the only reason I'm doing it. I'm not even doing it for science. Like this is for the people who are not able to speak to other people about their experiences. That's isolating and it's not healthy and it's not humane.
Exactly. I just want to, I would love to talk more, and I know we will. I just want to say thank you for not only the scientist that you are, but the scientist that you've become and the person that you've become. I
No,
think these,
thank you.
yeah, I think these are things that are great models for people that are having that chatter, having that anxiety, wanting to be like the uber productive one.
Mm,
There are other ways to be.
there are other ways to be. The greatest. That's the greatest thing you could have said.
Yeah. So really, thank you from the bottom of my heart, and certainly I look forward to having part two.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Take good care.